Hey gang, it's Samuel Culper from Forward Observer, and I'm interrupting my series on understanding Civil War II because I just published what's probably the most important watch report that I've ever filed. If you're a subscriber, you should go log into forwardobserver.com and read it. If you're not a subscriber, then you can read it with a 7-day free trial. Just go to forwardobserver.com and then click subscribe. All right, we're going to move through this pretty fast because there's a lot to cover, especially if you haven't been keeping up with a lot of this stuff. Now, let me warn you, I'm not going to be alarmist, but this is alarming. And it's not so much speculation on my part as it is following billionaires who are warning about these things. So in this month's Federal Open Market Committee meeting, Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell acknowledged that there was soft economic data emerging. And that's a potential warning sign of recession. And this, by the way, I know a lot of people say, oh, we're still in the Trump bump. The Trump economy is great. Yeah, there's been a lot of great numbers posted. However, if you take the time and actually go in and look at those economic numbers, you will find, it's very clear, you will find that that economic growth is fueled by debt. Most of it is fueled by debt. It's fueled by corporate debt. It's fueled by consumer debt. It's fueled by deficit spending and the national debt. This is illusory economic growth, and that's a very plain and easy case to make. So now that there are some weak economic numbers starting to come in, the effects of the tax cut, the effects of the Trump bump are wearing off now. Many investors expect the Federal Reserve to cut interest rates next month in July's meeting in order to stave off a recession. And some economists expect 2 rate cuts this year. One asset manager said he expected 4 rate cuts this year, which I don't think is the case. But it depends how weak these numbers get later on in the year. Now, this month, this is what's alarming to me. At the end of the last week of every month is my economic week. I dive into the economic numbers. I build this thing called a recession matrix, where I try to identify the consensus of hedge fund managers and banking CEOs and investors and kind of alternative economists. Try to find their consensus on their thinking about the next financial crisis or the next recession. And so I just got done doing that this afternoon, and I noticed that a lot of people now are starting to move up their expectations of a recession. So Jeff Gundlach, a guy I really like, I follow him quite a bit. He now says that there's a 45% chance of recession within the next 6 months. Bruce Kasman said that it might even start this year. He said there's a 40% chance that a recession is going to start this year. And by the way, these are big names, people at Morgan Stanley and JP Morgan Chase. And so what I've seen is this big shift of what these firms are saying this month compared to what they were saying last month. So I agree that we can absolutely expect the Federal Reserve to cut interest rates in order to stave off a recession and keep this economic expansion rolling along. Now, Jeffrey Gundlach has no faith in the Fed's predictive capability, and he believes that by the time the Federal Reserve notices that it needs to cut interest rates, it's already going to be too late. And so this, of course, has major implications for President Trump's reelection chances. There are high-profile money managers like Scott Minerd and Kyle Bass, and they both believe that the next recession is going to happen in 2020, basically before the election, and they say that it's going to be mild. Scott Minerd says this is going to be average severity. Kyle Bass says it's going to be mild. But the problem is that others like Jeffrey Gundlach have warned that this recession is going to present way more difficult challenges than most people are expecting or that most people even realize. And so if this recession poses the risks that Gundlach describes, then Trump's chances of reelection are seriously threatened. And if that's the case, then really it's time to batten down the hatches for higher taxes, for wealth redistribution, and all the other things that we heard and saw on this week's Democratic debates and all the things that they've been saying in the lead up to these debates. Some of these proposals are going to wreck the economy, and I described specifically how that's going to happen in today's watch report. The problem with cutting interest rates. So we've established the Fed is probably going to cut interest rates to keep this economic expansion going, basically making it cheaper to borrow money so that companies will continue to borrow money. They'll continue with their business expansion. They'll continue to hire and employ people. They'll continue buying the parts and the goods and the services that they require to make their stuff. Basically, if we look at an economy that is made up of economic transactions, the more economic transactions you have, the better the economy is doing. And so by cutting interest rates, the Federal Reserve is essentially promoting a higher volume of these economic and financial transactions. Well, the problem is if the Federal Reserve begins to cut rates this year, then they're going to have less to cut once a recession does hit, which increases the likelihood that the recession is more painful than just average or mild. So this week, Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell acknowledged that that is the case, saying, quote, "Interest rates are lower than in the past and will likely remain so. The persistence of lower rates means that when the economy turns down, interest rates will be more likely to follow close to zero, which poses new problems to central banks and calls for new ideas." Now, here is a snapshot of the federal funds rate. This is what the Federal Reserve cuts. When I say the Federal Reserve cuts interest rates, this is what I'm talking about. Basically, interest rates are based on the federal funds rate. So in the past two recessions, which are circled there, they're actually shaded in gray. Starting with 2001, the Federal Reserve cut interest rates from 6.5% going into the 2001 recession. And they cut them down to about 1%. And then they started raising interest rates again because the economy was recovering. And then prior to the 2008 recession, they began cutting interest rates from 5.25%, basically all the way down to 0% during the 2008 recession. And that recession, by the way, lasted 18 months. So that's longer than average. Well, today, the federal funds rate sits at around 2.25%. I think it was 2.39% when I looked at it this afternoon. And that's before any cuts this year. That does not bode well for the Fed's ability to soften the severity of the next recession. Because the Federal Reserve has 50% less to cut, that means that we're probably going to have a harder landing during the next recession. That's a much more likely scenario now. And the Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell actually admitted that in this month's meeting. Now, earlier this year, Bridgewater's Greg Jensen, now Bridgewater is a hedge fund. It's the world's largest and most profitable hedge fund. Greg Jensen he's the co-CIO, the co-investment officer there. And he warned of a period of poor economic conditions in the United States moving forward. He says, quote, "We think that the secular conditions and cyclical conditions are combining to create the situation where you're going to have this long protracted weakness in the developed world economies." He goes on. So basically what we expect to see is weaker growth and a movement to quantitative easing. And he continues after that. The struggle in Europe is probably going to click first. So that's our first indicator. Once these types of problems begin happening in Europe, the United States will experience similar problems and probably not be too far behind. Now, that mirrors what billionaire investor Stanley Druckenmiller believes as well. He said earlier this year that, quote, "The highest probability is that we struggle economically going forward." So who's right here? Are we going to have a mild recession, or is this going to be the beginning of a secular, in other words, a long-term period of persistently weak economic growth and general financial malaise? Well, right now, my money is on what Jeffrey Gundlach had to say earlier this month. He says, quote, "When the next recession comes, there's going to be a really big problem with the national debt. We're going to see," basically what he said, "we're going to see basically money printing, I think, to combat the next recession." So Gundlach describes here that money printing will lead to increases in long-term interest rates, which is actually going to make the recession worse. And maybe that's why Fed Chair Jerome Powell is openly calling for quote-unquote new ideas to reverse the effects of the next recession, because he doesn't have enough interest rates to cut to spur economic growth. I mean, he's basically running out of runway here. He cut from 5.5% or 6% the last two recessions. Now he's got to cut from 2.25%, and that's if he doesn't cut anything this year. But since he is going to cut this year, we can pretty much say now that he's open to cutting interest rates, the recession is not far behind. So when we combine all this information with my last two videos about low intensity conflict, we're talking about a lot of people being out of work, which is a universal indicator of civil unrest. You throw in job loss from artificial intelligence and machine learning and other automation that's going to come over the next 10 to 20 years. It's already happening in a lot of places. That's going to accelerate. Then we're probably talking about persistently high unemployment, and that's even after the recession ends. Now, in light of changes to this month's recession matrix, that report, by the way, went out to my warning subscribers earlier this afternoon. There's a solid argument to be made that the next recession is closer than we previously thought, and that it may actually rival the duration of the 2018 recession, which was 18 months, and it will probably also be followed by persistently low economic growth in the years following if we want to take the advice of the world's largest and most profitable hedge fund. So we could easily be headed towards Great Recession 2.0. This is essentially what Ray Dalio and Greg Jensen have been talking about for a couple of years now, this period of economic weakness. Ray Dalio specifically has warned about civil unrest, about the toxic political environment, and now you're going to have class warfare as a result. We see that's exactly what the Democrats are pushing here. And so really this model of low intensity conflict all of a sudden looks not only absolutely certain to happen, but it also looks like it's going to accelerate a lot sooner than maybe some people have thought. So consider that we may have about 12 months before this kicks off. Let's just say that Jeffrey Gundlach and those other people are right. We got 12 months before this kicks off. Gundlach says it. We got a 65% chance of a recession in the next 12 months. After that, it's extremely likely. 4 months after that, we have the 2020 election. In other words, that's going to be the absolute worst possible time. I think we need to be entirely open. I know a lot of people have speculated about this in the past, and now we actually have the evidence to say, yeah, this could actually happen. We have to be open to considering that a recession, regardless of how bad it is, because you know their media is going to play this up like we're going into Great Depression 2.0. What if a recession bumps Trump off of his 2020 victory? Right now, I think he has to be the favorite, but in light of this, we certainly should be open to the possibility that this causes a Democrat to get elected in 2020, and now it is time to batten down the hatches for all the things that they have promised that they will enact, and ultimately, I think it accelerates the timeline for low-intensity conflict to really explode. Now, I'll describe what I think that's going to look like in my next video, which is Breaking Down Civil War II, Part 2. And I'm probably not going to go Ken Burns' 12-part video series on you, but I'm going to go until I feel like we've covered enough bases to where people can actually understand what's more likely to happen and what's less likely to happen. So until then, until next time, stay out front.